Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. So today we're going to talk about math and fighting games. Yeah, combo. And if you're still here after seeing that, let's talk. And who are we kidding? You liked it. At least I did. Okay, so here's how this video is going to go. I'm going to talk about fighting games. I'm going to talk about the math within them and how really they are math. I'm going to talk about their basics. I'm going to talk about, you know, their evolution as well. And I'm also going to give my history and background and experiences with fighting games over the years. Because, right, like at this point, I have been gaming for over 30 years. Like over 30. Like that's wild. And for context, like I am pushing 40. I may not always look like that, but I am. And so like I've been gaming for a minute since I was 6. 1993. Uh and that's just my conscious memory of it because realistically, right, like I could have been gaming before that, but I as far as I remember, like I distinctly remember like getting Sonic the Hedgehog um when I was 6, 1993 for Christmas. I got the Sega Genesis and Sonic the Hedgehog came with that. Now, I thought like my parents just got that for me, but it turns out I asked. And the same thing would happen with Pokemon like years later, where it's like, hey, I thought my parents just got me this, but it turns out I asked. Who knew? But at any rate, so I've been gaming for a minute, and fighting games have been like crucial to that journey, and we'll get into it. Um, but I don't want to get too distracted from what I wanted to talk about like math wise, but we will get to it. Okay, so let's get into it proper. Just a note. You're probably safe from spoilers here because I'm going to be focusing more on mechanics of what fighting games are and my personal experiences with them, but I'm probably not going to dig deep into any narrative or realistically talk about them. Um, that being said, if you want to be extra safe, I get it. Yeah, so let's get into it. When it comes to fighting games, what are they largely about, like mechanically speaking, at their core? Um, no, there's going to be some tweaks on what I'm going to say. There's going to be some evolution um, and within that genre, and we'll get to it. But at that core, when a lot of people think about fighting games, realistically, a lot of people are going to think about that idea of, hey, you have these opponents and you're trying to like dish out damage while trying to avoid taking it, right? So it's like ideally you'd be at 100% and not take any damage. That would be nice, right? But like at a minimum you're trying to not reach 0% while trying to get your opponent to 0% in terms of your health, right? So that's the idea. You're dishing out damage while trying to not take it, and you're concerned with your health. And this is so that's the basics, but like I said, right, like that's not all, right? Because there's evolution, and some fighting games function differently. But like that's what a lot of people are probably going to be thinking about when they're thinking about fighting games. Um, and so yeah, you have this idea that hey, um, they're like inherently math, you know, and there's inherently math in what they are at their core. That idea of like dishing out damage while trying to avoid taking it, and then like you start adding in different like details and mechanics for different series. But if we start with some basic things that have popped up over the years, you have the idea of like, hey, you have the dishing out damage while trying to avoid taking it, and it's like, well, how are you implementing that damage, right? Like you have your attacks and you can do different combos. That's something that has progressed over time, right? And with those combos, so it's like, hey, you're pressing this button or that button or this button X amount of times, or maybe you're holding certain button for a certain length of time, or you're angling the directional pad while you're doing this move, or you're inputting like the different buttons while you're sorry the different face buttons while you're doing different things with the directional buttons that could have come out smoother. But my point is, right, that is all math. There's math in the combos and the timing in the buttons that you're pressing, how long you have to press them, how many times you have to press them, and what you're pressing, right? And then of course there's math and like the directions, what they are, the different angles you have to hit, and how you're doing that in conjunction with the different types of face buttons that you're doing. Um, if you're playing on PlayStation, for instance, triangle, square, circle, and X, just to provide kind of a more visual description of that. But the idea is like, yes, so you have these fighting games that are math at their core, and you have that general premise, and then you have your combos, you have your timing, you have the different angles, in position that you have to take, like in terms of what buttons you're pressing, but also what your character is doing on screen. And so you're paying attention to those things, but you're also paying attention to what your opponent is doing. And then you have the idea that like, hey, not only can you, attack, but do like combos, but over time you see a lot of other things pop up. Like, it's not uncommon that you can jump in some games, it's not uncommon that you can block, right? And it is not uncommon that over time not only can you block, but if you block at a certain time you can parry, right? Like you can counterattack, and there's math in all of it, right? And it's also not uncommon that you can throw. And then over time, we've seen special moves pop up, right? There's like, because right, like you might have these fighting games where like you're just going fist to fist, hand to hand, right? But you might also have weapons, and you have the idea that you might have these like short range, like melee weapon, or sorry, melee attacks. But you might also have some long range ones, and you might also have like some special attacks, right? Where you're putting in different things and performing these different combos for different results. And sometimes these like special moves, they're just like, hey, you can do them, and it's kind of a free move if you're doing the correct inputs. But in other cases, it may be a gauge. So I think that's pretty cool. I think that's pretty interesting, and you see this like pop up over time, and different mechanics arise. An example of a game that just like I think is really cool to me, and like implements a whole like a lot of different things is so I'll talk about it later because like Dragon Ball is like one of my favorite franchises, and I'm no stranger to a Dragon Ball like Z game. And I say Dragon Ball Z game because like it's mostly Dragon Ball Z games when you're talking about Dragon Ball games, but that's a whole another thing. But Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3 is a fascinating game to me, like, because it's a fighting game through and through, but it also has, like, some places or some segments of the game where, there's a story mode, right? And you can go around and do different stuff from that, but that's a whole other thing. And I've covered that in another video at length, but I wanted to bring it up because it's like it's an involved game in like the best way, and we're talking about like the mechanics. A lot of things that I say kind of come together in a really cool way there, because like, okay, right, you have that idea of like trying to dish out damage while trying to not take it, and in that game's like, yeah, you can block, you can throw, but you also like you have a couple different things that you're monitoring, right? Because you have your health, sure, but you also have your key gauge, and you can do special moves if you have enough key in those gauges, and those moves have certain costs associated with that key, and then it's like and there's some basic key attacks too, but like you can turn these things into like special moves, and you could also do ultimate attacks, and then there's also what the Dragon Rush. So it's like you have all these different things that you're monitoring, and there are ways to like get different items through like the story mode and like just progressing through the game, and you can like get more moves and like accumulate more money and just like customize a lot of things. And I think that's really cool because it's like, hey, fighting games have that really basic concept, but they can have all these other things going on. And then with like Dragon Ball, like Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3, of course, like a lot of other Dragon Ball games, you're flying around, and that adds this extra layer, to the equation, so to speak. Um, but I digress from my major point, or rather, that's part of the major point, and I didn't want to go too far with it because, like, if we're gonna start talking about Dragon Ball, it's a slippery slope, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just like that would be the whole video if I'm not careful. So my whole thing is just that, like, with fighting games, they have a simple idea that can be expanded because it's like, hey, like you're trying to dish out damage while trying to not take it, right? You're maintaining your health, and it's like, well, how are you doing all that? And it's like, hey, well, let's add in combos, let's add in these different positions that your characters have to take, these different inputs, these different angles, these different directions that you can move in. Let's string together these combos, let's have different special moves. So you start adding, you start expanding, and I've been mostly thinking about like the whole one-on-one deal, but like over time, again, like things have evolved, right? Because you have that like basic like one-on-one sort of deal, whether it's like you versus an actual person, you versus a computer, whatever the case may be. You have that essential part of fighting game in history, right? And that's still a lot of the games, right? But you also have the idea of like team matches, and that's pretty like common over time. And some games are like built around that idea is a selling point, i.e., like the Marvel versus Capcom series, or the X Men versus Street Fighter series leading into that, and a lot of those like Marvel and Capcom crossovers because there's a whole bunch of games, but my whole point though is that like that is a selling point in some cases, and you've seen like a plethora of games over the years they kind of like pop up to kind of fill that niche, because you don't really get Marvel versus Capcom games anymore. Like there hasn't been a major release since like well, okay, so there's the re-release like in terms of like a collection, but in terms of a specific game, right? The last one I think like was like Marvel versus Capcom Infinite, and oof, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't good. That's all I'm saying with that. But my whole thing, because I'm digressing, is just that you can do more than just that one on one. But no matter how you cut it, it's math because like with those team mechanics, it's like, hey, I'm gonna have these different characters, and they have their different strengths, their different weaknesses. I'm going to like mix and match, and in the case of like some of those like later like, Marvel versus Capcom games, it's like, hey, I'm also gonna have that idea of like them doing assists and stuff like that, right? And that shows up in games of that nature, like and that's all maps too, and I think that's really cool. And then you have some games where it's like you got the more like arena fighters, or platform fighters, whatever you want to call them, like Super Smash Brothers is like probably the best example of that, where it's like, hey, it's like their selling point is like it's not that they don't have that damage based sort of mechanic, because like there are modes and like different Super Smash Bros. Games where you can do more of that HP sort of deal. But the selling point in like typical mode is that idea like, hey, you have these characters and you're trying to ring out this person and that person, or like it's a little twist on the damage because it's like, hey, you have this character and they are accruing like damage, but what it is making them more vulnerable to ring outs. So you have like that added component to it, and it's still math. And so I really like that idea where it's like, hey, we took this basic concept and, we went from 2D to 3D. We have the one-on-one fighters, but we also have the team fighters. We have the arena fighters. We have fighting games with like story modes. We have story modes where it's basically fighting games. Um, and back to Dragon Ball, without trying to go down a rabbit hole, Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3 and like games of that ilk of that era especially, or like they're fighting games that like do have like a story mode that you could like explore, and you have that open world dynamic to it. But then you might have like the flip side with something like Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, where it's this open world game with this huge story, the one that you know and appreciate, that's focusing on Dragon Ball Z, or that Z segment of that Dragon Ball story. And so it's like it's got that, but like how you're navigating, how you're doing combat in that game, it's fighting. Um, so it's like we got like two sides of the same coin, and that I felt like I was waving, and it looked like my camera froze for a little bit, but not too bad. So we'll roll with it. But it threw me off. Okay, so I wanted to talk about all those things, and I can still talk about all those things, but I wanted to do that before talking about my background on a larger level, because like if I was going to talk about that from the beginning, like I know that I would keep on going, and I know because that's how I started. Like I had recorded a good amount, and then I decided, like, oh well, this is interesting, but it's not where I wanted to like spend the bulk of the time, at least in the beginning. Now that I've gotten a lot out of the way that I wanted to say, I don't mind going in more detail. But yeah, so I wanted to change the order But that also meant getting rid of what I had before, which is unfortunate. But I think, for me, sometimes that's part of the process because sometimes I could do things as is. Other times it's like, hey, well, maybe I can change the order in this, maybe I can change the order in that, but I digress. So my big thing, the big takeaway before going into more of my background with fighting games, is that like you have that idea for a lot of games that at its core with that fighting game, you're trying to dish out damage while trying to not take it. And you have so many different things over time that have been added to the genres that pop up in different fighting games because it's like, hey, well, how is all that happening, right? And so you have the idea of combos, you have the idea of like timing, different angles and positions to take into account. Like you're watching what your opponent is doing. If you have gauges involved, you're filling this gauge, you're filling that gauge, and you're, deciding when you're going to use like a special gauge for instance, or when you're going to use like a ultimate attack gauge for instance. And if you're in a team-based fighter, it's like, hey, I have this amount of people in my team, the opponents might have the same, maybe they have less, maybe they have more, but it's probably going to be the same. But like, how am I going to like handle this and just navigate that larger fight? You're considering things like that, or you're considering like arenas. You're dealing with these rich worlds that it's like, hey, I could be dealing with a fighting game that happens to have like a story mode, or I could be dealing with like a very story centric game that very much has a fighting component to it that's like crucial to the gameplay. Or you could have the case of like Star Wars Episode 3, like the game, where it's like, hey, you have this like action adventure game and you have this fighting game mode where it's like it's a game in and of itself. You have so many different combos, so many different evolutions, um, like different concepts like over time, and it's great. And so if we switch gears and we talk about more about my background and why I'm even talking about this in the first place, um, if we were gonna do that, this is the time. Okay, so with fighting games, I wanted to talk about them for two major reasons, like today, because like I've talked about them in the past, but I wanted to like give them their own like full length video, and part of that is because they've been a big part of my gaming journey, like over like the years, right? Like I've been gaming for over 30 years, and fighting games have been there pretty much from the start, like really early on. And the other big thing is, as I do this, I find that, like, look, math is everywhere and it's in everything, and sometimes like people don't see it that way, and largely that's because of how we have taught things. Like, right, we've siloed out math, and it's weird because the whole point of academic math is to make sense of this universe, and by focusing just on some of the elements that we focus on, we miss the point in a big way. Math is everywhere and everything. um, Math in an academic sense is like, it's like if you're a Jedi, um, you're aware that you can use the force, right? Like you're learning that, you're training, you're doing all that stuff, but the force is everywhere. So it's like, um, math is the force. It's everywhere and everything. It's always what you're doing and what you are, right? Like it's all that. And then like going to school, in theory, is like owning yourself and training yourself with the force and becoming a Jedi. Um, Again, in theory, because like, oof, the way we teach math, it's a problem. But my whole point of bringing that up, though, is I find that gaming, music, and food, these are all great ways to show people that they've been doing math the whole time. And with gaming, it can be really explicit in certain genres. Two big ones are like RPGs, role playing games, and another big one, fighting games, because there's so many like visual elements, visual representations of math in there, and I think that's cool. And so if we like talk about my journey though for a bit, since we talked about like um, how math pops up and like different things about fighting games. It's like this. So I started with my first game that I'm like aware of is Sonic the Hedgehog, or was Sonic the Hedgehog, right? But again, fighting games have been like pretty much there from the jump because uh, so at home, that was my first game and that was my only game for a while. But I would visit, family often. And with that family, they had one. They had a, like, they had the Genesis, like, the Sega Genesis, like I had, but they also had like the Super Nintendo, and they had like different games of different genres. And there was a lot of fighting games, and those fighting games, they were great ways to connect with my cousins, because like my family, we'd go to different family members, and we'd play those games. And like Mortal Kombat was pretty popular at that time, so we played different Mortal Kombat games. But like there's also Street Fighter and Killer Instinct, which nobody's talking about that these days. But I remember that was a part of my journey too, even if it doesn't get talked about much. And then so when I was younger, it's like occasionally, I would face off against the computer, but it was mostly a community experience, right? Like playing with my family, with fighting games. And then as I got older, that still was happening, but the more singular experience started to emerge because, like, you know, it's one of those things. Like I got to like, as I got older, it's like, hey, I wouldn't explore this passion of mine, and with fighting games, it's like it's really great to play with community, but I like that genre as a whole, so there's no reason for me not to explore that on my own. So that sort of came up, but like, but even before that, right? Like it's kind of a wild thing because I grew up at a time where we got to see like gaming go from 2D to 3D, and that was wild. And like one of those things that, like, given how many fighting games that we were playing, like we got to see that too, like pretty firsthand. And although like some games were more effective at using that 3D element than others, and that's a whole nother thing. But my whole thing is like it, it was really cool to see us go from 2D to 3D, and interesting to see how that like shaped up in terms of fighting games. And for the record, we're living in an age where we have 2D games and we have 3D games, or sometimes kind of a mix, and I'm here for it. There is room in this world for both, and I prefer it. I grew up on both. Yeah, so with fighting games, it's like, hey, we had Mortal Kombat, we had Killer Instinct, we had Street Fighter, and then before you knew it, we had Tekken, and we had Marvel vs. Capcom. There's a lot of other games before Marvel vs. Capcom, but like, we had that whole series and everything that led up to it, and of course Soul Calibur, and Soul Edge, which preceded it. But in terms of my personal journey, though, I didn't play every entry of every series, but like those were some that were like pop up, right? Like when I was in high school, Soul Calibur 2 was like crazy popular, and honestly, and this is not just my nostalgia talking, like that is still my favorite Soul Calibur, because like the other ones, they were good, and you had like the idea of like the character creation system and have that like expanded over time. But I just like the feel of Soul Calibur 2 because it is just so freaking fluid. Like it is. Yes, I like how it flows. It is fast paced. It is quick. Like it's easy to pick up. It can be difficult to master, but if you can master it, it feels good. And the other games are great too. But that was just like, for one, that was my entry point into the Soul Calibur series, like Soul Calibur 2. And I got to initially, like, play that in the arcades. And I also got to play Marvel vs. Capcom 2 in the arcades. And like that's wild because like I used to like visit the beach with my family, like growing up. And so, we would do cool stuff like see the ocean, but like at nighttime, we'd go to the arcade, like live it up a little bit. And so it's like I would like that. It would be cool. And I just like I remember getting to like play games like that, and also Star Wars Trilogy, which that was dope. But that's not a fighting game. I just wanted to mention it because it's cool. But yeah, so I got to do stuff like that, and like get different comic books like that. I remember there was one year where we got to do like go to the arcade and stuff. But and I remember, for whatever reason, I got like the issue. It was a comic book issue. It was like, I think it was an issue of Venom, and it's like where he was on trial. That was the thing that happened. Um, at any rate, back to fighting games. So I was lucky to have like a lot of cool experiences growing up, right? And so there's some of the ones that I mentioned in the beginning, and those series would like continue to survive and thrive, well, except for Killer Instinct. But um, sorry, let me backtrack. So it's like you have things like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Killer Instinct, Tekken, Soul Calibur, um, Dead or Alive, that would eventually get thrown in the mix. Um, Dragon Ball Z games, too numerous to list, but my favorite is Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3. It's the best. And of course, you had like the X Men vs. Street Fighter series, the Marvel vs. Capcom series, with Marvel vs. Capcom 2 um, being really high up there for me. But like also Marvel vs. Capcom 3 in particular, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 being crazy good, and also including characters like Dante and Virgil, as well as Trish from Devil May Cry. And if you've been keeping up with my videos, um, huge. I'm a huge Devil May Cry fan. Um, so that is awesome. And so you had like those like mainstays that like will pop up, and like I said, there was the Star Wars game, and that was cool. Um, and then over time, it's like I would play different fighting games, like different ones that would like pop up, and then some I would go and revisit, like you know, there was like some Guilty Gear games like Darkstalkers and stuff like that. And I would follow some of those same series that I grew up with and see how they evolved. Tekken's always been solid, but Tekken 2 is my favorite. But like Tekken 8, it is really high up there. Partially because like June returns and she's like my favorite character from Tekken, but also they just freaking killed it and they just like won like ridiculous and over the top with it as Tekken is prone to do, but like in just such a glorious fashion. Like they went all out. But yeah, so it's just like there's so many different types of fighting games out there, so many different series, and they have been like a huge part of my journey. Also, while we're here, let's talk about Dissidia for a second. Like I'm a huge Final Fantasy fan, and so like you know, I was aware that Dissidia existed. I did not have a PSP, so I didn't play that original. But eventually they made like a port of the art. I think the port of the arcade game, and that came in a form of like Dissidia Final Fantasy NT, and it's a weird game. Like there's so much um, that is good about it, but it's just such a weird feeling fighter. But definitely an experience for sure. Also, was like Materia. I like her outfit. That it's like it's very cool and colorful. And again, like the game, it's weird. I don't regret buying it, but like I don't rush to play that. But it is good. It's like, but not great. No offense to it. But it's just like, hey, that's another one because like sometimes you'll see like these franchises that have been around for a while, and they'll start to pivot into different genres. Like Final Fantasy, for instance, they've had like, I mean, Final Fantasy, they get into a lot of different genres. They try a lot of different things, and it's just like, hey, there was like a title that featured Final Fantasy characters. Like I think Energis, I think that's what it's called. But it had some Final Fantasy characters in it. But like the city is like, hey, this is Final Fantasy, and we're doing a fighting game, and there's a few of those out there. Um, so that's interesting. And also with Smash, like I mean that's been pretty consistent over the years. That's a good fighting game. But like I think Smash Ultimate does take the cake. They did some pretty bonkers things like with that one, and that's awesome. Also, while we're here, like it's wild that like Snake has been a part of Smash for a while. Because like Snake, from Metal Gear Solid, like that's crazy that he's in it. And like Metal Gear is one of my favorite franchises, so that's cool to see. Like I like seeing characters that are from gaming series that I enjoy pop up in fighting games because like the guest spot is an interesting thing. But at any rate, like I like fighting games like because like for the community experience more in person than online, it can be nice to build up that experience. It could be nice like bonding with others over that. And for the singular experience, it's like cool to have something that you could just pick up and play, and you can get deep with it if you want, or you can just like do it for a little bit. And I think that's cool. And there's some variety, and it's not uncommon for me to like have some fighting game that like I'm playing either on its own or in between games. Like there's usually some sort of fighting game in the mix, so and I think that's cool. And they've been a big part of like fighting games have been a big part of gaming, like gaming history. They're still a big part of gaming now, and they've been a big part of my life. And like I was born in the '80s and grew up in the '90s and 2000s, and it's like fighting games, like they're still around, but I felt like they were definitely prevalent there. You saw like a lot of birth of a lot of series or a lot of expansions, and like that's really cool. That being said, I think that's about all I have to say for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Professor Prime out.